Alright, we are going to begin this screencast with Chapter 14, Imperialism. Chapter 14 is the first chapter in Unit 5, and the reason we need to focus on imperialism before we get to the actual First World War itself is that imperialism is going to grow to become one of the main causes of the First World War. So first off, the definition of imperialism is when stronger nations extend economic, political, or military control over weaker nations. Now, believe it or not, America is going to engage in this process during this unit. It's going to extend its control over weaker nations. 5 reasons for American imperialism. First, manifest destiny. Obviously, we had pushed our country's borders all the way west to the Pacific Ocean, and now there's kind of this what's next feeling. Where are we going to go next? And so we start looking beyond our borders. Another reason is global competition. European countries had already gained influence on pretty much all other continents during this point of history. And so the reason stronger countries look to gain control over weaker countries is to kind of use and exploit their natural resources and ports. And so we are going to want to partake in that practice as well. Also, the desire for military strength. The United States definitely desires to become a kind of dominant, militant power in the world. We will eventually construct a very large and grand navy, and certain leaders have the desire to control different ports, different islands, different waterways to kind of lead in trade. Speaking of trade, reason number 4, to gain new markets for American-made products. We want to invest overseas and sell our products overseas in foreign markets. And finally, social Darwinism. We do kind of have this superiority complex where many Americans see themselves as racially superior to other groups, and it's kind of puts us in this mentality of it's our duty and our authority to assert our control over other regions. If you look at the pro and con arguments of the United States getting involved in global affairs at this time, we'll start with a con. Many people argue that the U.S. was already a large country, so we didn't really need more land. Some will also say it is hypocritical for us to try to assert control over other regions when we actually became a country as a result of us overthrowing the British Empire in our country. So it would be kind of hypocritical if we then asserted control over other regions. But people in favor of American imperialism argue that the U.S. was large and did need a large world economic market, and that we needed to participate and compete with Europe in this land grab race. So we'll talk about specific events at the turn of the century that gain America control beyond its original borders. First of all, Alaska. The Secretary of State, William Seward, will convince Congress to buy the land of Alaska from Russia. We actually buy it for a very reasonable price, roughly 2 cents an acre, but many people call out Seward saying that Alaska is just one large icy island, icy land, kind of isolated from the rest of the United States. But the truth is that Alaska is very rich in resources such as timber and minerals and oil, and it will be a successful purchase, but before people realize what a resourceful area it is nicknamed Seward's Icebox, or Seward's Folly, is kind of like saying, oh, Seward messed up by encouraging that transaction. Now, our acquisition of Hawaii is a bit more aggressive. Hawaii had been a refueling stop for ships going to and from Asia for centuries. It was definitely looked at as an ideal location geographically for the United States, as a good pit stop, but also a good potential naval base with Pearl Harbor in mind. Eventually, the U.S. would start trading with Hawaii for their sugar cane and pineapples. And eventually, even more so, you have Americans actually moving and purchasing land in Hawaii and running their sugarcane plantations out of Hawaii. But Hawaii was still a foreign nation at this time. The U.S. will eventually put a tax on foreign sugar in effort to protect American sugarcane farmers. This means that any sugar sold out of Hawaii would have to pay tax to the U.S. first before selling their sugar in the United States, and so Hawaiian sugar will become more expensive and as a result not sell as much. White plantation owners in Hawaii will actually ask the U.S. to annex the Hawaiian Islands in order so that the American planters can avoid paying that tariff. Now, the U.S. would be very interested in purchasing or acquiring Hawaii, again, because of its geographical location being so ideal in terms of influence in the Pacific region. But the only issue is Hawaii already had its own government. It had a monarchy, and the current queen monarch, and you will need to know how to spell this, so you might want to write this down now, is, and you can look at the spelling on the slide if you want. The current Hawaiian monarch was the Queen Liliuokalani. Liliuokalani. And that is spelled Liliuokalani. And she is pictured on the slide. I hope it's not out of vision for y'all. So there's already a sitting queen, and the Hawaiian people love their queen. But essentially, the U.S. government will overlook the fact that there's a monarchy in place. They will invade Hawaii using the Marines, and with the help of white plantation owners, they will overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and select her successor as governor, whose name is Sanford Dole. Dole as in Dole pineapples, the brand. Now, the president at the time was President Grover Cleveland. He refused to officially annex Hawaii until the Queen was restored to power, and he wanted the people of Hawaii to elect to be annexed. So it won't be annexed for some time. But then, in 1897, President William McKinley happily annexes Hawaii as an American territory without getting any approval from the Hawaiian people themselves. And just a side note, the states of Alaska and Hawaii will not actually become official states until the 1950s. They are originally just United States territories, much like Puerto Rico today. Now, the Spanish-American War is something that often gets lost in between the Civil War and World War I because it isn't very well known and it wasn't fought for a very long amount of time. But it is important to our country's history because many territories are acquired because of it, territories that in some cases we still have today. It starts with Cuba. Now, Spain had been losing its influence in the world, and specifically the Western Hemisphere, over many decades. Remember, Spain was one of the first colonizers of the Americas. It controlled much of Central and South America, including many Caribbean islands, such as Cuba. But slowly but surely it began to lose control in the Western Hemisphere. It was also losing control of Cuba itself. And the U.S. was very interested in Cuba because we were very invested in their sugarcane industry. Cuba would like to be independent from Spain. And in Cuba's second war for independence, the man pictured on the right, Jose Marti, whose name you do not need to know, leads a revolution against the Spanish, in which he hopes the U.S. will help, since they have interests in that region. Okay, and they basically hope the Americans will help them overthrow their Spanish controllers. Now, Spain will send many Spanish military units to put down this rebellion. Spain will be very cruel to the Cubans during this revolution. The conditions for the Cubans are very rough. But American journalists are going to take advantage of that in effort to sell stories. And this is where the term yellow journalism comes into play. Yellow journalism refers to kind of exaggerated and fabricated accounts of what actually happens in historical events. And they do this in order to sell stories and make things more sensationalized and interesting. You have two major newspaper publishers competing with each other, and their names are Hearst and Pulitzer, as in the Pulitzer Prize. These two newspapers begin selling the most exaggerated stories of the Spanish atrocities and the Spanish aggression towards the Cubans in this Cuban Revolution, mainly just to outsell each other, and wartime makes good stories. They're almost publishing such devastating accounts and really heinous accounts of what's happening, to the point that they're trying to convince Americans to want to go to war against the Spanish to defend the Cubans, since wars sell money and make money. They sell stories. Just to show you how far they were willing to go, Hearst himself is known to have sent out one of his sketch artists to basically draw pictures and document what's happening in Cuba. And when the sketch artist writes back and says, the conditions of the Cubans and what the Spanish are doing to them really doesn't warrant a war from the United States, like, it's really not as bad as we're making it out to be, Hearst replied to him historically by saying, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war." So you have the media at the time, which is really just, not the media, but the press, really pushing America into war. Another event that's going to kind of encourage Americans to want to go to war against the Spanish is the Dulum letter being published. President McKinley was the president at the time, and he really tries super hard to keep Americans uninvolved in this war. He wants to keep us out of the war and out of, foreign affairs. But a Cuban revolutionary manages to steal a personal letter from a Spanish ambassador whose last name was Dulum, and in this personal letter, Dulum is criticizing President McKinley as being weak. And a newspaper publisher buys this letter and publishes it and prints it in their newspapers, so all of Americans see this letter, and it kind of outrages Americans against the Spanish, and it kind of urges them to want to go to war. And then, lastly, and this is going to be the final straw that pushes Americans into this Spanish-American War, is the sinking of the USS Maine. The USS Maine was a naval ship that was sent to Cuba's harbors soon after the Dulum letter, in effort to just kind of oversee American interests in Cuba. And while it was in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, it exploded into flames, and roughly 200 sailors were killed. Now, within hours, yellow journalists will blame this event on the Spanish, saying that the Spanish blew up our ship, which is possible, but definitely not proven. And this publishing of this story will spark outrage to the point where a battle cry is formed: "Remember the Maine." And just like remember the Alamo, but remember the Maine, and meaning remember what they did to us, let's go to war. President McKinley at this point will ask Congress to declare war against the Spanish, and in 1898 that is what they do. The U.S. actually initially fights the Spanish in the Philippines, which seems very odd, as the Philippines is not located near Spain or Cuba or the United States. It's actually a set of islands in the Pacific Ocean. But the Spanish control the Philippines at this time, so that is why they are going to push for a war here. Admiral, pictured on the right, George Dewey, will lead the U.S. naval fleet into the Philippines Bay, known as Manila Bay, and they are actually able to successfully defeat the Spanish fleet with the Filipinos' help. The Filipinos help the Americans defeat the Spanish because they are hopeful that the Americans will give them independence, complete independence, and not try to control them themselves. But when the Spanish finally surrendered to the U.S. did retain the Philippines as a protectorate. And we'll learn about what that is, but essentially we do not relinquish the Philippines to be independent. We kind of control them as our territory. The U.S. will, of course, also fight the Spanish in Cuba itself. We successfully managed to blockade all Cuban ports, but our U.S. Army at the time was pretty weak, made up of poorly trained, poorly equipped volunteer soldiers, because we're in between wars and we really haven't created a standing army in the event of international conflict, since we haven't really been involved in international conflict before. But certain volunteer groups were very well known, such as Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Teddy Roosevelt, pictured on the left, led a group of volunteer cavalrymen called the Rough Riders to lead in very successful battles in the Caribbean, specifically in Cuba. And many groups actually helped Teddy Roosevelt's, it wasn't just his unit, it was several units that helped capture many Cuban towns, but he's given kind of all the credit, and he really arises and emerges as the wartime hero. The U.S. fleet would eventually officially defeat the Spanish in Cuba, and the Spanish would lead their final surrender in Cuba. Also important to know about Puerto Rico, that in this war, the U.S. took Puerto Rico without a fight. The whole war really lasted less than 6 months, pretty much, maybe 7 or 8 total. But of course, this war will end, shocker, with a Treaty of Paris, 1898. And in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, several things happen. For one, Cuba will gain official independence from Spain, but it's still pretty much under American government's control. Secondly, Spain will cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Cede as in C-E-D-E, like cession. So we are given Puerto Rico and Guam, which are territories today. And lastly, Spain will sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Now, Puerto Rico really had wanted independence from Spain and from the United States, but it was actually pretty geographically important to us to maintain influence in the Caribbean for a future project that we'll talk about later in this chapter. You should kind of be thinking about certain engineering projects that you might know of in history in the Caribbean. But Puerto Rico had wanted to become independent, but we would not allow that. We said that we will not really be harsh to the Puerto Ricans, but that we would help to protect them as our territory. And eventually they would become what's known as a commonwealth, which is essentially where they are a territory of the U.S., but they have certain rights in our government. For example, they are able to send representatives to Congress, but they don't get to vote in the Electoral College per se. So it's kind of a hybrid of sorts, and that's what they are even to this day. Now, even during the war itself, while Cuba was happy to have America's involvement on their behalf, they were fearful that Cuba would be annexed by the United States after the Cuban Revolution was won. So the first thing that America responds to this with is actually during the war itself, the Teller Amendment was added to the Declaration of War that stated that Cuba would be given its independence after the Spanish-American War was won. To be frank, though, no political freedom was actually given. We didn't actually annex it, but we did control them. The Platt Amendment would be later added to the Cuban Constitution, which stated several things. One, the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuba if Cuba was ever unstable. Secondly, Cuba must become a protectorate of the U.S., meaning we're going to kind of just oversee Cuban affairs. And lastly, Cuba must lease harbors to the U.S. for naval bases, such as Guantanamo Bay. We will pretty much kind of exert this semi-control as a protectorate over Cuba until communism erupts in Cuba in the 50s. Alright, we're going to pause the screencast here. There's going to be a second part to this with a few more notes, but if you would just pause this and click on the next screencast for the later half. Thank you.